Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the monumental complexity of the history of World War I. We're going to unpack exactly how a single, localized political assassination spiraled completely out of control, right? It turned into an industrialized global conflict that literally altered the course of human history forever. Let's get into it. So let's kick things off with a provocative thought. Imagine we had a time machine. If we went back to June 28, 1914, and stopped a 19-year-old student named Gavrila Princip from assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand, would the Great War have never happened? I mean, the Archduke's driver literally took a wrong turn and by sheer coincidence stalled the car right next to the assassin. It sounds like a rejected Hollywood script, doesn't it? But as you probably know, the reality of this history is way more complex. Because the truth is, that assassination was just a spark. To truly understand why 20 million people lost their lives in the ensuing conflict, we've got to look at the massive mountain of explosive tension Europe had been piling up for decades. Basically, you can't blame the matchstick for the dynamite, right? So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the mountain of dynamite, move on to the spark that ignited Europe, brave the industrial meat grinder, examine a global war of exhaustion, and finally, look at the armistice and aftermath. All right, Section 1, the Mountain of Dynamite, pre-1914 tensions. There were four main forces actively driving Europe toward war. First up, unchecked imperialism. You had European powers scrambling to capture and loot territories all over the globe. Second, there was this aggressive race-based nationalism taking hold. Third, and this is absolutely crucial, militarism. Get this, the military spending of the six great powers actually quadrupled between 1870 and 1914. Everyone was arming to the teeth. And finally, to top it all off, they locked themselves into a tangled web of secret alliances. All these underlying tensions crystallized into two massive opposing alliance networks formed from mutual protection. On one side, you've got the Triple Entente, Great Britain, France, and Russia. On the other, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So what does this actually mean? Well, it essentially guaranteed a domino effect. If one nation went to war, every single one of them would be dragged right in. And, adding a layer of really deep irony to this whole powder keg, the monarchs controlling three of these massive empires were literally first cousins. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, Russia's Tsar Nicholas II, and Britain's King George V, they all belong to the exact same family. It's wild to think about, but millions of common people were about to be sent to the slaughter over what was, at the very highest levels of power, basically a deadly family feud. Moving on to Section 2, the spark that ignited Europe, summer of 1914. So that assassination we mentioned, it triggered a rapid-fire domino effect. After the Archduke was killed in Sarajevo by Bosnian revolutionaries who wanted a united Yugoslav nation, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Now, because of those secret alliances we just talked about, Russia immediately stepped in to defend Serbia. Then Germany quickly jumped in to defend Austria-Hungary. To get to France faster, Germany invaded neutral Belgium, which thoroughly angered Britain, instantly bringing them into the fray. Boom! In just over a month, this unstoppable accelerating chain reaction dragged the entire continent into conflict. Which brings us to Section 3, the industrial meat grinder, 19th century minds meeting 20th century weapons. Commanders entered this war with a fatal flaw. They had an old-school war mentality, but they were going up against modern technology. I mean, the French literally sent soldiers wearing bright blue uniforms and red trousers, marching in tight columns across the countryside. And they were marching directly into the path of devastating modern machine guns, heavy artillery, and eventually poison gas. It was a complete mismatch. The reality of these trench assaults was just a gruesome, endless loop. Soldiers endured days of ear-shattering artillery bombardment that left so many of them deeply shell-shocked. Then they'd be ordered to rush across a muddy, corpse-filled no-man's land, only to be cut down by relentless machine gun fire. Attackers would send wave after wave, with thousands of men dying just to gain a few meters of blood-soaked mud. Truly horrific stuff. To really put that meat grinder into perspective, consider this staggering number, 365,000. That represents the French casualties at the Battle of Verdun alone. And the crazy thing? The German general Erich von Falkenhayn specifically designed this battle not to capture territory, but as a pure strategy of attrition. His goal was simply to bleed France white. And the grim irony is that the Germans ended up losing almost as many men in that very same battle. Let's look at Section 4, a global war of exhaustion, beyond the European trenches. Now, you have to remember, the war's reach extended way beyond European borders. Because these combatants were massive empires, they pulled in colonial troops and vast resources from all across the globe. India sent massive numbers of soldiers to support Britain. Australian and New Zealand forces, the Anzacs, faced some absolutely brutal combat at Gallipoli. There were guerrilla campaigns in African colonies and Arab revolts against the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. This wasn't just a European war, it was a truly world-encompassing struggle. And it wasn't confined to land either, or even to active combatants. 1,198. That's the number of lives lost when a German submarine torpedoed the passenger liner Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. 128 Americans were among the dead. This shift from a strictly military war to one involving unrestricted submarine warfare and civilian casualties, well, it deeply turned American public opinion against Germany. Back home, the relentless slaughter was just breaking the spirit of the public. Contrast the early jingoistic propaganda, which portrayed war as this glorious, gentlemanly adventure, with the sobering reality captured by poets like Thomas Hardy. It really highlights the tragic shared humanity of the soldiers. I mean, these were often poor, working-class men forced into horrific conditions, shooting at each other for the greed and pride of empires. This massive disillusionment actually led to widespread instances of troops just refusing to fight. There were mutinies, and of course the famous 1914 Christmas truce, where soldiers spontaneously stopped fighting to celebrate together in no man's land. By 1917, sheer exhaustion was literally breaking nations apart. French troops were mutinying. The Russian Empire completely collapsed into the Bolshevik Revolution, pulling Russia out of the war and allowing Germany to shift all its forces to the west. But just as Germany gambled on starving Britain with submarines, the British intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, where Germany actually tried to incite Mexico against the US. This was a game changer. It finally pushed the United States to declare war, injecting fresh, massive resources into the battered Allied lines. All right, Section 5, the Armistice and Aftermath, the Ashes of Europe. In early 1918, Germany knew American troops were arriving, so they launched one last, desperate, massive offensive, and it failed. The Allies, now bolstered by those fresh American forces, launched the 100 Days Offensive, pushing the exhausted German army into a full retreat. With their own allies collapsing, German troops mutinying, and the Kaiser fleeing, Germany signed an armistice in a railway carriage. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. But the human cost of this conflict, it's almost unfathomable. 9.5 million soldiers were killed. Think about that. That is 1 in 8 of everyone who fought. Alongside them, 21 million were wounded, and an estimated 7 million civilians lost their lives. The highly industrialized nature of the war created a scale of tragedy the world had simply never witnessed before, permanently scarring the psyche of an entire generation, what we now call the lost generation. The geopolitical landscape was permanently altered too. 4 ancient, massive empires completely collapsed into ashes. The Russian, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and German empires were entirely dismantled. The map of Europe and the Middle East was drastically redrawn, creating new nations and new borders out of thin air. In fact, many of the borders and tensions we see in the modern Middle East and Eastern Europe today, they were born right here, in the ashes of these fallen empires. The peace was officially sealed at the Paris Peace Conference by the Treaty of Versailles. But the terms placed on Germany were incredibly harsh and punitive. The treaty severely restricted their military, demanded crippling financial reparations, seized their colonies, and, perhaps most devastatingly of all, forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the entire history of the conflict in a controversial war guilt clause. Which leaves us with this haunting final question to reflect on as we wrap up this explainer on the history of World War I. In their desperation to punish the losers and carve up the spoils of the fallen empires, did the victors of the Great War inadvertently cultivate the deep seeds of resentment that would set the stage for an even darker sequel just 2 decades later? It's something to think about. Thanks for joining me today, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.